Afternoon. We were kind of waiting for all the dancers to exit. I think they have exited now. So we'll go ahead and start. I am Ernestine Berry. I'm a tribal historian, also the director at the Cultural Center and Museum in Tahlequah, Oklahoma of the United Keetoowah Band of Cherokees. This afternoon we'll be talking about the Western Cherokees. Now, the Western Cherokee, that designation was not a designation from the people, but it was a designation given to the people by the U.S. government when they moved into Arkansas, and that was by a treaty. They were called the Western Cherokees because they were the farthest west Cherokees at that time. So we have been known as Keetoowah. Keetoowah in English, they say Keetoowah. So this afternoon, we want to talk about the Cherokees who moved west before the Trail of Tears. I know you've probably heard about the Trail of Tears, and there were many who came on the Trail of Tears, and that was an important event in the history. But there were also a contingent of Cherokees who moved west before the Trail of Tears. Now, these people were more traditional people. And we'll see here this afternoon exactly who they were. They were referred to in the 1817 treaty as the more traditional people who wanted to continue their traditional way of life. And of course, by the 1800s, there was a lot of intermarriage with the Europeans who had come. And by 1690, there was just about a daily contact with the Europeans who had come. And so there was a lot of commerce going on, trading of skins and so forth with the Europeans. And by the 1800s, the late 1700s, the early 1800s, the hunting had become not so good. And so they wanted to remove to the west. Because of that, it's not that they really wanted to, but they felt some pressure, of course, to move to a different area in order to avoid conflict with the whites and also to have better hunting. They began removing in the 1790s, and they again removed into Indian Territory in 1828 when they had a treaty with the U.S. government to move farther west. There was some things that happened in their history in the East that kind of brought about the removal of themselves, and that was the conflicts that were there in the East with the frontier militia and the Keetoowah, or the Western Cherokees, were some of the warring groups, the fighting groups. Another one was the Chickamaugas, who were called that. They were Keetoowahs, but they were called Chickamaugas because they lived at Chickamauga Creek in Tennessee. The incident at Muscle Shoals, now as you see this map here, it shows all of the territory that the Cherokees claimed when the white people came from Europe. It includes most of Kentucky, all of Tennessee, present-day North Carolina, part of South Carolina, part of West Virginia, part of Georgia, and part of Alabama. So you can see how large the territory was that was claimed by the Cherokees at the time that the whites came in. Over a period of years, their landmass became smaller and smaller because of land speculators and because of sales and because of treaties with states. And then finally in 1785, the first treaty with the U.S. government, which was called the Treaty of Hopewell. And under this treaty, there were several provisions, of course. One of them was that they would cede land to the United States, which was always a provision in any treaty, was for the cession of land. And the U.S. government promised to remove U.S. citizens from the Cherokee Territory, and the crimes committed were to be judged under U.S. law. Traders had protection, And the Cherokees had the right to send a deputy to Congress. And as always, they pledged peace and friendship among themselves. Also, there was a payment for the land that they ceded. If you can see the orange arrows in this map, it shows a little bit of green on the right-hand side that was ceded at that time, and a little bit of yellow on the left-hand side where the orange arrows are, that shows the land that they ceded under the Treaty of 1785. So as you could see, their land mass was shrinking and shrinking after every treaty. The incident that happened at Muscle Shoals had to do with Chief Diwali. He was a Chickamauga chief. He took over when the main Chickamauga chief passed away, who was Dragging Canoe, and they were a warring group, and they were the last group to stop fighting to protect and maintain their homeland in the South, to protect it from the white settlers. And they were the last ones. And so in the 1790s, they were still some skirmishes, but in 1794, it was just about all over for them. And so they began to look for other places since their land had been taken. The incident at Muscle Shoals happened when Chief Diwali and his men went to a Tellico blockhouse to collect their annuity for the land that had been ceded. And they collected their money and started back down the Tennessee River in their boat, or boats. They were going along Muscle Shoals. They stopped at Muscle Shoals to hunt for food and to rest. And there were also some white immigrants, men, women, children, and black slaves, who were also going down the Tennessee River and stopped at Muscle Shoals. They had long boat poles. Some of this river was shallow at places, and they had to have those poles to push along sometimes. So they had these long poles, similar to the ones you see here, that had metal tips on the end, and they were very hardy, hardwood poles. There happened an incident that involved the white traders that were there with those white people who were going down to New Orleans. And Scott and Stewart were there, and they soon learned that the Cherokees had money. So they lured them aboard their boat and plied them with whiskey. And soon they had the Cherokees' money, and the Cherokees had very small little items, such as mirrors and beads, paint. But then, of course, the Cherokees didn't stay drunk forever. They finally realized that they had been taken advantage of. And the next morning, Chief Diwali went aboard the trader's boat. He took the goods back, and he asked for a refund of their money. And of course, that was not going to happen. Scott and Stewart laughed at him and told him to get off the boat. So he went back to his men, and then he took 2 of his men back with him and tried to persuade them to give their money back. Stewart and Scott used one of those long boat poles, thrust it into the chest of one of the men. He fell in the water and he died. And also they hit another one in the head with the pole, and he died also. So there was the rest of Diwali's men were over on the shore, and when they saw that, they came aboard and killed the white men that were in that party. They left the women, the children, and the black slaves were unharmed. So the Cherokees went down the Mississippi. They went over to the Mississippi, down to the mouth of the St. Francis River, which is in present-day Arkansas, and they stayed there for a while. But then they decided that they would have to give themselves up, because they had said they would be judged under U.S. law under the terms of the Treaty of 1785. So they were compliant with that, and they turned themselves in, and the U.S. did an investigation into the situation, and they were cleared from from the accusations of murder. So they were justified. The U.S. investigators felt they were justified in what they did. Whether we would judge it that way today, I don't know. But at that time, it was judged that they were justified. Following the Muscle Shoals incident, many of the the more traditional Cherokees began to immigrate across the Mississippi into Arkansas Territory. Of course, Arkansas Territory was much larger at that time than the state of Arkansas is right now. Arkansas Territory went on over across the river, the Arkansas River, into what we know as the state of Oklahoma right now. And so they began to migrate into the Arkansas Territory. Chief Diwali had about 60 families who were in his group there in Running Watertown in Tennessee. And when they migrated into Arkansas, just about all of them followed him because he was the Chickamauga chief, the one that they followed. And later on, Chief Diwali decided to go into Mexico Territory, which was into Texas, present-day Texas, in 1819. And then he was killed in Texas fighting the Texans in 1839. So they were searching for a land base, someplace they could call their home, because they felt like that they had been restricted in their own territory. And so they were hunting for a place that they could settle down and call home. But then when they went into the Mexican territory, they also had to fight the Texans. Okay, the Cherokee tribe, does anybody have any questions about that? And I think we have someone here with a microphone. If anybody has a question, the gentleman up in the booth asked me to stay behind the desk. I was coming out and talking to people because I can't see so well with the lights shining. They've turned the lights down a little bit today, so it's very helpful. But if you have a question, anybody have a question? Okay. Let's go on. The Cherokee tribe was divided. As I said before, there was a part of the Cherokee tribe that wanted to follow more of the ways of the Europeans who were coming in among them and have a government, a civilized government, they called it, and agriculture. Of course, we had always had agriculture. Our people always had small gardens outside their homes that each family managed, and especially the women took care of it. But they wanted to have fixed laws like the U.S. government. So they wanted a separation between the upper towns and the lower towns, and the Hiwassee River was to be the division line. If you know anything about Tennessee, it was in Tennessee. The division line was in Tennessee. So they wanted the lower towns where they could just live their traditional life, and the upper towns would be more like the Americans. And this fit pretty much with President Jefferson's plan because he wanted to remove the Indians from that area and put them into the Louisiana Purchase, which they had acquired in 1803. The Cherokees then went into Arkansas. They were given permission to go and scout out a place where they would find it commodious for them to live. And they went into Arkansas. At the top right of your map there you see is the White River, and the bottom is the Arkansas River. So it was between the White and Arkansas rivers in north central Arkansas, like it is today. And this is the area that they scouted out where there was plenty of water, plenty of animals to hunt, vegetation, and so forth. It was a very good place to live. And so they said, this is the place that we want to live. And so that was in 1809. And then for the next few years, the Cherokees began migrating to that area, although they had no treaty and they had no right to that land. So then by the time of 1817, there was 2,000 or 3,000 Cherokees already living there. In 1817, they got a treaty with the U.S. government that gave them the land in Arkansas, and they gave up some land in the east, land cession, for that treaty. If you look at this map, the bright green area here on the left is the area that they still maintained in 1817. All the rest of this land had been ceded in one way or another to Americans. And so what they actually had at the time of 1817 was just a very small amount of what they had originally had. The map on the right shows the landmass, the bright green area there shows the landmass that they had after the Treaty of 1817. So their landmass was shrinking more and more. The provisions of the Western Cherokee Treaty of 1817, they were to take a census. 1818 annuity was paid to both the Western and the Eastern Cherokee, and the treaties were in full force for both segments of the tribe. The U.S. was to provide goods for them to immigrate and to prevent white intrusion into their western lands. Most of these things did not happen as it ordinarily went with treaties. The U.S. government reneged on several of those things. The preamble to that 1817 mentions the separation of the Cherokees into upper and lower. And if you can see this map, the Hiwassee River is the river there. Well, I don't know how to explain it to you, but the Hiwassee River was to be the division between the upper and lower. And you can see that there were, or at least there were people from the upper and lower towns that immigrated to Arkansas. The little houses there that are marked on this map designate the villages where the people came from who signed on to the 1817 immigrant roll, and the 1817 treaty applied to them. So the people who came from the east, it not only pertained to the people of the upper towns, and it pertained also to the lower towns and some from the upper towns. So there was a division there, but it wasn't a geographic division. It was more like a cultural division. When the Cherokees came into the Arkansas Territory in 1809, they were invading into Osage Territory. There where they designated their reservation between the White and the Arkansas rivers, that was claimed by the Osage as a hunting ground. And so they had lots of battles with the Osages. They would attack the Cherokees frequently, trying to drive them back to the east so they wouldn't be bothered with this new tribe coming in on their, what they considered their area. The Cherokees then had to fight to maintain their land there. And Chief Takatoka, he finally, after there had been several treaties signed and several treaties broken, he just called the Osages just a bunch of liars, and we declare war against them forever. So he was not happy with the situation there. He was one of the old Keetoowah priests and medicine man, and he was very well respected and revered among the Western Cherokees, or the Keetoowahs. In 1816, though, the Indian agent who was there, William Lovely, he decided that maybe he could persuade the Osages to give up some of their land there in the Arkansas Territory and give it over to the Cherokees. And so, in fact, he did. They ceded 7 million acres to him, and it was not an official cession. In 1818, the Osages did then finally cede their land, 7 million acre tract, to the United States. Immediately, the white settlers began clamoring for the right to settle in Lovely's purchase. In 1817, the Cherokees were weary of war with the Osages, and they said, okay, we're going to have a battle here, and it's going to end the battle of all battles. Does that work? Does that usually work? No, it doesn't. And it didn't work this time either. So they did recruit some of the Chickasaws, some of the Shawnees to come in and help them so that they could rid themselves of war with the Osages. But the skirmishes and the battles continued until in 1822, in the federal government, they again signed another treaty, the Cherokees and the Osages, and then the federal government said, okay, you guys, this time, whoever breaks this treaty will suffer retribution from the U.S. government. And so they had by that time built a fort at Fort Smith and a fort at Fort Gibson, so that there was U.S. military there to kind of guard the peace and make sure that it lasted. Chief Tolentesky invited the missionaries during this time of war and turmoil that was going on in the West, invited the missionaries to come in to create a school for the children. Dwight Mission was opened January 1st, 1822, with about 15 students. Eventually there was about 50, and even later on, the Osages sent some of their children to school there. This school lasted until the 1930s. My mom went to school there in the 1930s, and just soon after it was a school for first through the 8th grade. And when she finished the 8th grade, just a few years after that, it was closed for the Indian students, and most of them went to public schools after that. Okay, then the whites and the Cherokees had conflict over Lovely's purchase. Are there any questions up to this point? Anybody have a question? Yes, we have a question right over here.
When the two tribes got together, what language was taught in the school?
What language?
Yeah, because didn't the Cherokees and the Osages have their own languages?
Yes, they did. Well, you know, as would happen probably between two different cultures who speak different languages, they would speak their own language, and maybe by that time there may have been some of them who had learned the other tribe's language, because they had been together since 1809, and maybe by 1870 some of the Cherokees had learned Osage and some of the Osages had learned some of the Cherokee. So even though they were two cultures, it may have been, and I don't know this, I haven't read it anywhere, but it seems like that would be reasonable, that they probably would have learned some of the language. I think we have another question over here.
I don't need the microphone. Actually, you do, because it's being webcast. I was just going to ask, though, are these slides available for educators to use?
No, not right at the moment, but if you can leave your name and your address with me, I can make them available to you.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, anybody else? Okay, when President Monroe was there, he was more or less sympathetic with the Cherokees, and he tried to give them what they had been promised, the acreage that had been promised. And also he tried to limit the white settlement within the Cherokee lands. And he said that they had been promised an outlet to the west for their hunting. And Secretary of War Calhoun, he acknowledged the Cherokees' right to the Lovely's purchase. And so in 1821, the whites were removed from Lovely's purchase. And then there was a big protest by the whites and by the news agencies. They were protesting against the Cherokees having the rich lands of the Lovely purchase. And in 1822, the governor of Arkansas Territory did a survey. The survey that he drew was lines in favor of white settlement, and he gave the Cherokees land that was full of rocks and hills, and that was about it. And then, guess what happened? The Cherokees protested. So there was that coming back and forth between the white settlers and the Cherokees again. So in this letter that we obtained from the National Archive, it tells about how the Cherokees were very dissatisfied and disgusted by the actions of the Arkansas territorial governor at the time to survey the land to give them the worst part of the land and reserve the other for the whites. Although President Monroe was favorable to the Indians in trying to give them what they had been promised, when John Q. Adams came in, he was not so favorable to the Indians. So They actually did a survey which gave them part of Lovely's purchase, but when John Q. Adams became the president, then there became a movement to remove the Cherokees from that area again and send them farther west. In 1825, James Barber, who was the Secretary of the War, mentioned that perhaps it would be good if the Cherokees would move on farther west into Indian Territory and exchange the Arkansas lands for lands in Indian Territory. Chief Jolly responded that he did not want to remove farther west, that he wanted to maintain his land, and that they had no land that they wanted to part with. So they wanted to remain in the Arkansas area. However, President Adams opened up that land for white settlement. In 1826, the Congress authorized the unassigned portion of Lovely's purchase to be surveyed and sold to the white settlers, and that put them west of the Cherokees, which they were promised that there would never be white settlement west of them. And so Commissioner McKinney stepped in and he persuaded the president to stop the surveying and selling until the Cherokee problem was resolved. But he also recommended that the Cherokees remove to the west, giving them a large land area in the west. And so President Adams said, okay, we'll give them their land area in the west. And they approved 7 million acres in the Indian Territory, but Adams threatened them, if you don't take this deal, then we'll take some of the land that you have already. So the Cherokees, in their final move west, moved into Indian Territory. Now, do we have any questions about anything up to this point? Okay. In 1828, the Western Cherokees signed a Treaty of Washington, giving up the land in Arkansas Territory and moving into Indian Territory. They were given 7 million acres, including an outlet to the west, which was an area across what is now the state of Oklahoma and just a little bit of Kansas. Of course, there was no state line there at that time, but it was all across this Oklahoma up at the northern border with Kansas, and it stopped at the area that was the end of the United States at that time, which was not including the Oklahoma Panhandle. It was just right at the edge of Oklahoma as we know it today without the Panhandle. And that's where they had an outlet to the west, which they had been promised for hunting purposes. And someone asked yesterday about the Osages being there today, and there are Osages, that's their property today. The Cherokees traded some of their land in the eastern part of Oklahoma to the Osages for the Osage, it's called Osage County right now. They were traded for that, and that land happened to have lots of oil on it. So that kind of left the Cherokees without the oil money that the Osages received. But the Osages had problems with that also, so we won't go into that today, but they did have problems with the oil money that they had and the people wanting to come in there and take it from them. Okay, one of our most famous Keetoowahs, or Western Cherokees, was Sequoyah. He joined the Western Cherokees in 1823, 2 years after the invention of the Cherokee alphabet, or syllabary. And he was one of the 5 Western chiefs that signed the 1828 treaty. And he moved into the Western Territory in Indian Territory with the Western Cherokees. And for the first time when they signed that treaty, that was the first time they had signed their names in their own language instead of just making X marks. Before, they had always just made an X mark on the treaty, but this time they had their own language to sign it in, which was really a wonderful thing to them to be able to communicate. They were given 14 months to uproot everything and move into Indian Territory. Sequoyah moved with them, and most of them moved just across the Arkansas line into what now is far eastern Oklahoma. in the counties of Sequoia, Adair, and Delaware. And that's where most of the Keetoowahs live today, is in those counties. They established their homes and their schools and their governments, and they were just finally hoping that they had reached the end of their moving, that they wouldn't have to move again, which they did not have to move again. The mission that was in Dardanelle, close to Dardanelle, Arkansas, was closed, and in 1829 the missionaries moved that mission into Indian Territory. It was the White Mission, and the missionaries moved with them at that time. And then in 1838-39, then the rest of the Cherokees were forced out of the east over the Trail of Tears. And I think everybody, or a lot of people here, probably have heard about the Trail of Tears. And they came into the Indian Territory. They were much more numerous than the Western Cherokees or the Keetoowahs. And the Keetoowahs at that time were called the Old Settlers because we were the first ones into that land. My mom, when I went to school and I learned about the Trail of Tears, I came home one day and I said, "Mom, when did our people come over the Trail of Tears?" And she said, "We didn't come over the Trail of Tears, we were already here." And I didn't understand that because I had not been able to study any kind of Western Cherokee. In the schools, the public schools, they don't teach anything about the Western Cherokees or the Keetoowahs. And so I began to try to learn about that part of my history because I'm descended from the Western Cherokees or the Keetoowahs. But when the Cherokee Nation came in, Chief John Ross had an active union drawn up to unite both segments of the tribe. And the idea was to take over the government that was already there and become one unit under his leadership. And because they were much more numerous than the Western Cherokees, they did indeed take over the government at that time. However, just before statehood, the government of the Cherokee Nation was terminated. That is the word used in the law. The government was terminated. And then statehood came in 1907. So from that time, 1906 actually, until 1967, there was no Cherokee government. But in the 1930s, during the Great Depression, the U.S. Congress passed acts to help the Indians reform their governments. One was called the Indian Reorganization Act. The other one was called the Oklahoma Indian Welfare Act, which dealt with Oklahoma tribes, of course, because there were no reservations in Oklahoma. After the allotment period, there were no reservations, and there still are no reservations there. So the Keetoowahs got their recognition to reorganize the government in 1946. And then in 1950, we had our governmental documents approved by the U.S. government, and we became the only Cherokee tribe officially organized in the Indian Territory. And then in 1976, the Cherokee Nation leaders began to reform their government. And so that's why we have two Cherokee tribes in Tahlequah. There's the Keetoowah Band and the Cherokee Nation. Okay, we have any questions? Yes.
I'm going to go backwards a little bit to the language question,
Okay.
where you say that in the treaty removing to Indian Territory that Cherokee people were able to sign in their own language. But the treaty itself would have been in English.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Would there have been enough understanding of the terms? Were there enough English speakers to understand the terms, not just sign them?
Well, I think there were quite a few English speakers, but whether they would understand the legal terminology in those treaties, probably not. But they did understand that they would be required to give up their land and move. They'd already been through that before, so they knew that would be required. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Thank you. Anybody else have a question? Yes.
So, you mentioned about the tribe that was already there, the Western Cherokees, before the Trail of Tears. Once the Trail of Tears happened and the two tribes came together, was there any like turmoil at
Yes, definitely.
because you said there
As
was
you
like,
could imagine,
yeah,
those
some
people
were
who were there.
traditional and then some were like kind of still trying to, I guess, acclimate into the American culture, I guess. So, how how long did it take them to kind of come together once after the Trail of Tears?
Well, that's a part of the history that's really not part of this presentation, but after the Cherokee Nation came in, there was actually three groups there. One was the Keetoowahs, or the Western Cherokees, who were there first, and then those people who signed the Treaty of 1835, giving away all the land in the east, they came in, and then the Cherokee Nation came in, and those three groups, there was a kind of a civil war that set up after they all three got there, and there was so much turmoil there that happened. And yes, it did cause a lot of turmoil because the Cherokee Nation wanted to take over the whole government, and the Western Cherokees, there were some that did sign that treaty, the Act of Union that John Ross had drawn up. The Western Cherokees, there were some that did sign it, but the majority of them did not want to sign it. They did not want to be absorbed by the Cherokee Nation. And so, yes, there was a lot of turmoil. Any other questions? Yes.
So, maybe, I mean, this is also tangential maybe, but when the U.S. government decided that tribal nations could start their, or reestablish their governments after the Depression, how was tribal enrollment determined at that point between the different Cherokee communities?
Okay. During that time, there was the Keetoowahs, who incidentally had fought in the Civil War on the side of the North, and the Cherokee Nation had fought on the side of the South. So there was another division there. But when the people came and they wanted to reform a government under those acts, the Keetoowahs immediately began to try to organize and get permission or recognition in order to organize a government. They used their 1859 Constitution, which they had written up prior to the beginning of the Civil War. And the purpose of that Constitution was to hold the Keetoowahs together and to prevent them from fighting each other and killing each other. And they declared at that time, in 1858, that if they were forced to fight or they felt compelled to fight in the white man's Civil War, that they would join the side of the North. And the reason was, and it states this in their Constitution, that the Southerners had always been the ones who had taken what they had and drove them out. And they said, they even have their feet on our necks now, and they have no love. So we do not want to fight on their side. However, when it came down to it, they were trying, at that time, they were in agreement with Chief Ross. He wanted to remain neutral. Also, they wanted to remain neutral. So they were kind of backing him instead of going to the Confederacy. But when he gave up and joined the Confederacy, then the Keetoowahs began to desert and go to the North. But they had that Constitution already that did act as a cohesiveness to bring them together so that they wouldn't be fighting, killing each other. They were known at that time by the name, the Keetoowah Pins, because they wore, and this is Civil War stuff I'm giving you here now, but they wore pins under their lapels or under their collars, and they could just flick that, and then you would know that they were Keetoowahs. If there were others, they would do that, and they would say, okay, we know who's who now. And so they wouldn't be killing each other. They also had a way of touching their hat brim. When they came into a room, maybe of people or into a crowd somewhere, they would touch their hat brim in sort of a salute so they would know that they'd be able to identify who the Keetoowahs were, because they were there in where most of the men were affiliated with the Confederacy. So when they came back to the Cherokee Nation from the east, they went into Kansas, come back down, then they would know who was with them and who wasn't. Does that answer your question?
I mean, so they must have had,
Pardon?
on top of that, that's fascinating, but on top of that, they must have then had a census, I guess, when they, around the time that they brought the Constitution of 1858? They wrote the Constitution of 1858, the Keetoowahs, or? I mean,
Yes.
they must have known
Yes, the
who each
Keetoowahs
other were.
wrote the Constitution of 1858. So they knew who they were. Even, after that period of time, they knew who they were. And even today, I know that I am descended from the Western Cherokees or the Keetoowahs. Yes. Okay, yes.
I think part of the question is coming forward and into the 20th century. What were the criteria that you could become Keetoowah or decide to be Cherokee Nation, and how does that carry forward today?
Okay. All right. As I have explained, the more traditional people wanted to remain traditional. And so that kind of goes along with blood degree. If you are 1/4 or more Cherokee blood, then you can join the Keetoowah band. If you're less than that, you can't. And it still holds that way today. We have 1/4 blood degree requirement. I think the Eastern band has 1/16. The Cherokee Nation has no blood degree requirement at all. You just have to prove to the Dawes enrollment, you have an ancestor on the Dawes enrollment. The Dawes enrollment was the enrollment that the federal government did prior to the allotment. And that's how they determined who got some land. Now, my grandparents were on that. And we still have some of my grandmother's land. And in order to hold that land in restriction, you have to be 1/2 or more. And we still have some of that land. Most of her land we still have. And she was given like 60 acres, and then she had her dad's land and her grandmother's land and her aunt, and then one cousin who was an illegitimate son, but he died when he was 9 years old, and so she and her sister inherited that land also. So they had quite a bit of land, just her and her sister. And that's how they determine even enrollment today in the United Keetoowah Band.
We have time for this last question.
Okay.
How long after the last group of Cherokees came over to Oklahoma did it take them to actually have a census? Did they have a census just of their own tribe? Or did they keep records of who came?
Yeah, they had an enrollment when they came west. The old settlers had a roll. The people who were left, the Cherokee Nation, they had a roll. And so, yes, there are records of that. Mm-hmm.
Where are the records now?
Well, you can find copies of those at the Cherokee Nation and probably in the U.S. archive somewhere. I think they have genealogy there, do they not? They have quite a bit.
They have a Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. At the Heritage Center, they have the roll.
At the Heritage Center in Tahlequah. Okay. I was thinking more of, someplace where it might be more convenient to this area.
They do have copies in the National Archives,
In the National
which
Archive,
is like
yes.
2 blocks away.
Okay, is that it?
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for coming. Appreciate your attention.